In the vast expanse of Alaska, where winter nights stretch for months and the nearest neighbor might be hundreds of miles away, small towns cling to existence like flickering candles in an endless darkness. These aren't the cozy communities you might imagine. These are places where survival is a daily battle, where the line between civilization and the wild grows thinner with each passing storm. Towns with names like Nome, Kotzebue, and Barrow, settlements that exist at the very edge of the world. But isolation does something to a place. It creates pockets of silence so deep that when something disturbs that silence, it echoes in ways that can't be explained. What you're about to hear are 9 stories from Alaska's most remote communities. Stories that have been whispered in January stores, passed down through generations of fishermen, and shared in hushed tones around wood-burning stoves when the wind howls outside. These aren't urban legends crafted for entertainment. These are accounts from real people, witnesses who lived through experiences that challenged everything they thought they knew about their world. Store clerks who vanished in broad daylight, lights that hover over frozen bays with no explanation, hospitals where the dead refuse to rest. Each story comes from a different town, but they're connected by something deeper than geography. They're bound together by Alaska's unforgiving wilderness, by the kind of isolation that makes people question whether they're truly alone in the darkness. Some of these events happened decades ago. Others are more recent. All of them share one common thread. They defy rational explanation. They're the kind of stories that make you check your locks twice before bed, even when you know your nearest neighbor is miles away. In Alaska, the wilderness doesn't just surround these communities. It seeps into them. It becomes part of the fabric of daily life, until the boundary between what's natural and what's supernatural begins to blur. When you're living at the edge of the world, strange things don't seem quite so strange anymore. Tonight, we'll journey through 9 small Alaskan towns where the impossible became reality. We'll walk down frozen main streets where people disappeared without a trace. We'll visit abandoned buildings where the past refuses to stay buried. We'll hear first-hand accounts from those brave enough to speak about experiences that most would rather forget. These stories will take you from the northernmost settlement in America to fishing villages where the ocean itself seems to hold secrets. From underground tunnels that echo with voices of the dead to fog that swallows boats and spits them back empty. Each tale is more unsettling than the last, but all of them share Alaska's unique brand of terror, where the cold isn't just a discomfort, it's a living thing that seems to watch and wait. So settle in, Once we begin this journey into Alaska's darkest corners, there's no turning back. These 9 stories will stay with you long after the last word is spoken, reminding you that in the world's most isolated places, we're never truly alone. Story 1. The Man Who Vanished on Main Street, Nome, Alaska. Nome, Alaska sits on the edge of the Bering Sea like a collection of weathered, wooden blocks scattered across the tundra, with barely 4,000 residents. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where a stranger walking down Front Street would be noticed immediately, and where the disappearance of a local would send shockwaves through the entire community. That's exactly what happened on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday in March of 1987. Thomas Kellerman had been working at Hanson's General Store for over 15 years. At 43, he was as much a fixture of Nome as the old gold dredges that still dotted the coastline. Tom was reliable, predictable, and methodical. Habits. Every weekday at exactly 12:30 p.m., he would lock the store, walk 3 blocks down Front Street to the Polaris Cafe, order the same turkey sandwich and black coffee, and return within exactly 45 minutes. On March 17th, Tom followed his routine perfectly. Sally Hansen, the store owner, watched him lock the front door and head west toward the cafe. The temperature was a mild -12 degrees, typical for late winter in Nome. The streets were relatively clear, with only a light dusting of snow from the previous night. What happened next would puzzle Nome residents for decades to come. Tom never arrived at the Polaris Cafe. Martha Kowalski, the cafe owner, knew Tom's schedule as well as anyone in town. When he didn't show up by 12:45, she began to worry. Tom had never been late, not once in all the years she'd known him. By 1 p.m., she was concerned enough to call Hansen's general store. Sally Hansen answered on the first ring. "He left right on schedule," she told Martha. "Locked up at 12:30, just like always. He should have been there 20 minutes ago." The walk from Hansen's to the Polaris Cafe was 3 blocks in a straight line down Front Street. There were no side streets, no shortcuts, no places to stop along the way. It was impossible to get lost. More importantly, in a town like Nome, it was impossible to disappear. But Thomas Kellerman had done exactly that. By 2 p.m., when Tom failed to return to open the store, Sally called the Nome Police Department. Officer Jim Crawford was the first to respond, and he began retracing Tom's expected route immediately. What he found defied all logic. Tom's footprints were clearly visible in the snow, leading west from Hansen's general store. Crawford followed them step by step, noting how they matched Tom's distinctive winter boots, size 11, Sorels, with a unique wear pattern on the left heel. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the snow, indicating Tom had been walking at his normal pace. Crawford followed the footprints for 2.5 blocks. Then, at the intersection of Front Street and Stedman Avenue, something impossible happened. The footprints simply stopped. Not at a building, not at a vehicle, not at any kind of shelter or obstacle. They stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, as if Thomas Kellerman had simply evaporated into the Arctic air. Officer Crawford stared at the spot for several minutes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There were no other footprints nearby. No tire tracks, no signs of a struggle. The snow around the area was undisturbed except for Tom's trail, which ended as abruptly as if someone had drawn a line and declared that no further footsteps would be allowed. The search for Thomas Kellerman began immediately. Every resident of Nome was questioned. Every building along Front Street was searched. Dogs were brought in to track his scent, but they led searchers to the exact same spot where the footprints ended, then sat down and whined, refusing to go any further. The investigation expanded beyond Nome. State troopers were called in from Anchorage. Search planes combed the surrounding tundra for any sign of Tom or his body. Volunteers organized search parties that spread out across the frozen landscape for miles in every direction. Nothing was found. Days turned into weeks. The initial theory was that Tom had suffered some kind of medical emergency, perhaps a heart attack or stroke, and had wandered off the main street in confusion. But this theory crumbled when searchers realized there were no other footprints leading away from that final spot on Front Street. No tracks leading into alleys. No evidence he had fallen or collapsed. No indication he had ever moved beyond that precise location where his footprints ended. 3 weeks after Tom's disappearance, a spring thaw revealed something that made the mystery even more disturbing. Additional footprints were discovered leading out of Nome toward the coast, pressed into what had been frozen ground beneath the snow. These prints matched Tom's boots exactly, including the distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. But here was the problem. These footprints led in a straight line from the edge of town to the Bering Sea, a distance of nearly 2 miles. They showed no deviation, no hesitation, no human variation in stride or direction. They were spaced exactly 24 inches apart, as if Tom had been walking like a machine, with mechanical precision that no human could maintain over such a distance. The footprints led directly to a cliff overlooking the frozen sea, where they stopped at the very edge of a 50-foot drop. Below, the ice was solid and undisturbed. There was no body, no evidence of impact, no sign that anyone had ever fallen or jumped. Thomas Kellerman had simply walked off the edge of the world and vanished. The case was never officially closed, but it was never solved either. Nome residents developed their own theories over the years. Some believed Tom had been abducted, though no one could explain the mysterious second set of footprints or how an abduction could occur in broad daylight on a busy street without witnesses. Others whispered about more supernatural explanations, suggesting that something in the Alaskan wilderness itself had called Tom away from his ordinary life. Sally Hansen kept the general store running for another decade before finally closing it down. She never hired another employee, never trusted anyone else with the daily routine that Tom had followed so faithfully. She said the store felt different after Tom disappeared, as if something vital had been extracted from the building itself. Even today, nearly 40 years later, visitors to Nome sometimes ask about the man who vanished on Main Street. Longtime residents will point to the intersection of Front Street and Stedman Avenue, where the sidewalk looks the same as it always has. But they'll tell you that on certain clear days, when the light hits the pavement just right, you can still see the faint outline of footprints that end in the middle of nowhere. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howls in from the Bering Sea, some say you can hear the sound of boots walking steadily down Front Street, heading toward a destination that no living person has ever reached. Story 2. Lights over Kotzebue. Kotzebue sits 33 miles above the Arctic Circle, where the Kotzebue Sound meets the Chukchi Sea. It's a place where the sun doesn't set for over 2 months in summer and doesn't rise for nearly 2 months in winter. For the 3,000 Inupiat residents who call this remote settlement home, the rhythm of light and darkness follows ancient patterns that connect them to both the land and the sea. But in the winter of 1993, the lights that appeared over Kotzebue followed no natural pattern at all. It started on a bitter January night when the temperature had dropped to 47 below zero, the kind of cold that makes the air itself seem brittle, where exposed skin freezes in minutes, and even breathing becomes a conscious effort. On nights like this, most of Kotzebue's residents stay indoors, huddled around oil heaters and wood stoves, waiting for the endless winter darkness to pass. Jimmy Kanguk was different. As one of the town's most experienced subsistence hunters, he was accustomed to the harsh conditions that would send most people running for shelter. That night, he was checking his gill nets through holes in the sea ice, a routine task that required venturing onto the frozen Sound in conditions that would challenge even the most seasoned Arctic resident. At approximately 11:30 p.m., as Jimmy was hauling in his nets by lamplight, he noticed something unusual in the sky above the Sound. At first, he thought it might be the aurora borealis, the northern lights that frequently dance across the Arctic sky in brilliant sheets of green and blue. But these lights were different. Instead of the flowing, ethereal movements typical of the aurora, these lights appeared as distinct, geometric shapes that hung motionless in the sky. There were 7 of them, arranged in a perfect hexagonal pattern, with one light positioned in the center. Each light was roughly the size of a full moon and glowed with an intense white radiance that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. Jimmy had lived in Kotzebue his entire 46 years. He had seen every variation of natural Arctic phenomena, from sundogs to ice crystals, from the aurora to atmospheric reflections. What he was witnessing bore no resemblance to anything in his extensive experience with the northern sky. The lights remained stationary for approximately 20 minutes. Then, without warning, they began to move. Not the random, organic movement of natural phenomena, but with deliberate, coordinated precision. The 6 outer lights maintained their distance from the center light, while the entire formation descended slowly toward the frozen sound. As the lights drew closer to the ice, Jimmy realized they were much larger than he had initially estimated. What had appeared moon-sized from a distance were actually massive, luminous objects, each easily the size of small aircraft. Was roughly the size of a full moon and glowed with an intense white radiance that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. Jimmy had lived in Kotzebue his entire 46 years. He had seen every variation of natural Arctic phenomena, from sundogs to ice crystals, from the aurora to atmospheric reflections. What he was witnessing bore no resemblance to anything in his extensive experience with the northern sky. The lights remained stationary for approximately 20 minutes. Then, without warning, they began to move. Not the random, organic movement of natural phenomena, but with deliberate, coordinated precision. The 6 outer lights maintained their distance from the center light, while the entire formation descended slowly toward the frozen sound. As the lights drew closer to the ice, Jimmy realized they were much larger than he had initially estimated. What had appeared moon-sized from a distance were actually massive, luminous objects, each easily the size of small aircraft. A light they emitted was so intense that it illuminated the surrounding landscape as if it were daylight, casting stark shadows across the snow-covered terrain. Jimmy's sled dogs, who had been resting quietly beside his ice fishing setup, suddenly became agitated. All 12 dogs began howling simultaneously, not the familiar sound of dogs responding to distant wolves or other natural stimuli, but a high-pitched, almost human-like wailing that Jimmy had never heard before. The dogs strained against their tethers, trying desperately to flee, their eyes wide with what could only be described as terror. The formation of lights continued its descent until it hovered approximately 200 feet above the ice, directly over the area where Jimmy had been fishing. At this distance, he could see that the lights weren't simply luminous objects, but appeared to be emanating from something solid, something with mass and structure that remained invisible against the night sky. Then came the voices. At first, Jimmy thought he was hearing the wind, which often creates unusual sounds as it moves across the ice and snow. But as he listened more carefully, he realized the sounds were too structured, too purposeful to be natural. They were voices, speaking in what seemed to be Inupiaq, his native language. But the words were wrong, arranged in patterns that made no grammatical sense, as if someone was speaking his language without understanding its meaning. The voices seemed to come from directly above, from the area where the lights hovered. Multiple voices, men and women, adults and children, all speaking at once in that strange, broken version of his native tongue. Jimmy could make out individual words, familiar terms for ice, sea, hunt, family, but they were connected in ways that created no meaning, no coherent message. As the voices continued, Jimmy noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Among the incomprehensible chatter, he heard his own name being called, not once but repeatedly, pronounced with perfect clarity and accuracy. "Jimmy Kanguk, Jimmy Kanguk," the voices said, over and over, as if trying to get his attention. Jimmy had spent his entire life in one of the world's most remote locations. He was accustomed to isolation, to the kind of solitude that most people never experience. But hearing his name called by invisible voices from the sky filled him with a primal terror that he had never known existed. The lights remained in position for another 10 minutes, while the voices continued their strange, repetitive calling. Jimmy's dogs had stopped howling, but remained huddled together, whimpering softly and refusing to look up at the sky. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights began to rise. The formation ascended rapidly, maintaining its hexagonal pattern as it climbed back into the night sky. Within seconds, the intense illumination faded, leaving Jimmy alone on the ice. With only his small lamp for light, the voices stopped abruptly, as if someone had turned off a radio in the middle of a broadcast. Jimmy gathered his nets and equipment as quickly as his frozen hands would allow and raced back to town with his dog team. He went directly to the house of George Ballot, Kotzebue's mayor, and described what he had witnessed. Ballot was skeptical at first, but Jimmy's obvious distress and the strange behavior of his normally calm sled dogs convinced him that something unusual had occurred. Word of Jimmy's experience spread quickly through the small community. Over the next 3 days, 5 other residents reported seeing unusual lights over the sound, though none as close or as detailed as Jimmy's encounter. Mary Sage, who lived near the shoreline, said she had seen lights moving in formation across the sky, but had assumed they were aircraft from the local airport. Tom Booth, a pilot who operated charter flights out of Kotzebue, confirmed that no planes had been scheduled to fly that night due to the extreme weather conditions. The mystery deepened over the following weeks. Several residents reported that their sled dogs had begun behaving strangely, refusing to venture onto the sea ice after dark, and becoming agitated whenever they were taken near the area where Jimmy had been fishing. Even dogs that had been traveling those routes for years suddenly refused to cross certain sections of the frozen sound. More disturbing were the reports of voices. On clear, calm nights, residents living near the shore claimed they could hear faint speaking coming from the direction of the sea ice. The voices were too distant to understand clearly, but they seemed to be calling names, the names of people who lived in Kotzebue. Children's names, adults' names, the names of elders and respected community members. The phenomena continued sporadically throughout the winter. Lights would appear over the sound every 2 or 3 weeks, always in the same hexagonal formation, always accompanied by the strange voices speaking broken Inupiaq. Each time, the town's dogs would react with the same terrified behavior, and each time, residents would hear their names being called from the empty sky. By spring, when the sea ice began to break up and the long Arctic night gave way to continuous daylight, the lights stopped appearing. The voices fell silent. The dogs gradually returned to their normal behavior, though many continued to show reluctance when taken near the shoreline after dark. Jimmy Kanguk continued his subsistence hunting for several more years, but he never again ventured onto the sea ice alone at night. When asked about his experience, he would describe what he had seen with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting the weather. But his eyes would grow distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the horizon, something that had no business being in the skies above his hometown. Today, nearly 30 years later, Kotzebue residents still speak in hushed tones about the winter of the lights. Elder community members have no traditional stories or legends that explain what Jimmy and the others witnessed. It remains an anomaly in the collective memory of a people who have lived in harmony with their harsh environment for thousands of years. But on the clearest winter nights, when the temperature drops well below zero and the aurora borealis dances across the Arctic sky. Some residents still report seeing unusual formations of lights over the sound. And those with the sharpest hearing sometimes claim they can still detect faint voices calling across the ice, speaking words in a language that sounds almost, but not quite, like home. Story 3. The Abandoned Hospital in Wrangell. Wrangell sits on an island in southeast Alaska's Inside Passage, a town that has witnessed the rise and fall of 3 different industries over its 150-year history. First came the fur traders, then the gold miners, and finally the loggers and fishermen who still call this remote island home. Through all these changes, one building stood as a constant in the community: Wrangell General Hospital, a 3-story concrete structure built in 1952 to serve the medical needs of the island's residents. For 23 years, the hospital was the beating heart of Wrangell's healthcare system. Babies were born in its maternity ward, broken bones were set in its emergency room, and the elderly found comfort in its long-term care facility. Dr. Margaret Chen, who served as the hospital's chief physician from 1961 to 1975, later described it as a place where life and death walked hand in hand through the same corridors every single day. In 1975, a new modern medical facility was constructed on the other side of town, and Wrangell General Hospital was officially closed. The building was supposed to be demolished, but budget constraints and bureaucratic delays kept postponing the demolition date. Years passed, and the old hospital simply sat empty, its windows dark, its halls silent, slowly being reclaimed by the southeast Alaskan wilderness. By 1982, the hospital had become an unofficial dare for Wrangell's teenagers. Breaking into the abandoned building was considered a rite of passage, a test of courage that separated the brave from the cautious. Most kids would venture no further than the ground floor lobby before losing their nerve and fleeing back to the safety of the street. But some went deeper into the building, and those who did came back changed. Sarah Mitchell was 17 when she first entered the old hospital in October of 1982. She was with 3 friends, all of them armed with flashlights and the kind of nervous bravado that teenagers use to mask genuine fear. They had planned to explore the entire building to prove they were braver than the other kids who had chickened out after just a few minutes inside. They entered through a broken window on the east side of the building, climbing carefully over the sill and into what had once been a patient room. The October night was cold and damp, typical for southeast Alaska's autumn weather. But inside the hospital, the air felt different. It was colder than it should have been, with a humid, stale quality that seemed to stick to their skin. The 4 teenagers made their way through the ground floor, using their flashlights to navigate around debris and fallen ceiling tiles. The lobby was exactly what they expected from an abandoned building: empty, dusty, and filled with the detritus of neglect. Chairs were overturned, old paperwork was scattered across the floor, and the reception desk was covered with a thick layer of dust and dead insects. It was when they reached the stairwell that things began to feel wrong. Sarah later described the sensation as walking into a wall of invisible pressure, as if the air itself had become thicker and more resistant. Each step up the staircase required more effort than it should have, as if they were climbing through water instead of air. Their flashlight beams seemed dimmer, less effective at penetrating the darkness ahead of them. On the second floor, they discovered that many of the patient rooms still contained furniture. Hospital beds, some still made with yellowed sheets. Wheelchairs positioned beside windows, as if patients had been looking out at the forest just moments before. Medical equipment covered with dust, but still plugged into walls, waiting for electricity that would never come. It was in room 237 that they heard the first footstep. The sound came from somewhere above them, a single, distinct footfall on the floor of the third level. All four teenagers froze immediately, their flashlights trained on the ceiling as they listened for any additional sounds. The building had been empty for 7 years. There was no electricity, no heat, no reason for anyone to be inside except for teenagers like themselves looking for a thrill. They waited in silence for nearly 5 minutes. No additional sounds came from above, and eventually they convinced themselves that the noise had been caused by the old building settling, or perhaps a small animal that had found its way inside. They continued their exploration, moving through the second floor's corridors and peering into rooms that had once housed the sick and dying. In the old surgery suite, they found something that made their blood run cold. The operating table was still in place, complete with overhead lights and surgical instruments laid out on a tray as if a procedure had been interrupted rather than concluded. The instruments were covered with rust and corrosion, but they were arranged with surgical precision, each tool in its proper position, according to medical protocol. More disturbing was what they found written on the wall beside the operating table. In what appeared to be dried blood, someone had scrawled a list of names in shaky handwriting. The names meant nothing to the teenagers, but the dates written beside each name ranged from 1952 to 1975. The exact years the hospital had been in operation. It was while they were examining this macabre discovery that they heard footsteps again. This time, multiple footsteps, moving in deliberate patterns directly above their heads. The sounds weren't random or chaotic, like those that might be caused by animals or settling timber. They were rhythmic, purposeful, as if several people were walking back and forth across the third floor in some kind of organized activity. Sarah's friend Marcus suggested they investigate the third floor, but the moment he made the suggestion, the footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow more unnerving than the sound had been. It felt expectant, as whatever was making the noise was now listening for their response. Against their better judgment, the four teenagers climbed the stairs to the third floor. The psychiatric ward had been located on this level, along with the hospital's morgue and administrative offices. The air here felt different from the floors below, not just colder, but somehow thinner, as if the oxygen had been partially depleted. The first thing they noticed was that their flashlights were becoming less effective. The beam seemed to fade after only a few feet, swallowed by a darkness that appeared almost solid. They were forced to stay close together, following the beam of whoever was in front as they made their way down the central corridor. Room 314 was where Sarah's courage finally failed her. The door was partially open, and as she shone her flashlight through the gap, she saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The room appeared to be occupied not by squatters or other teenagers, but by patients. She could see figures in hospital gowns, sitting on beds, standing by the window, moving through the room in the slow, careful manner of people recovering from serious illness. But these patients cast no shadows, despite the direct light from her flashlight. And when she looked more closely, she realized she could see the wall behind them, as if they were only partially present in the physical world. Sarah stumbled backward, directly into Marcus, who grabbed her shoulders to steady her. But when he looked into room 314, he saw something different. Instead of patients, he saw medical staff, doctors and nurses moving efficiently around the room as if responding to some medical emergency. Like Sarah's patients, these figures seemed translucent, visible but not entirely solid. The other two teenagers, Jenny and Paul, each reported seeing different scenes in the same room. Jenny saw children, young patients, who appeared to be playing games despite the illness. Paul saw elderly patients, some connected to medical equipment that flickered with lights despite the building's lack of electricity. All four were seeing different things, but they were all seeing something. The room wasn't empty, despite being abandoned for 7 years. It was occupied by the memories, the echoes, the imprints of all the human suffering and healing that had taken place within its walls. That was when they heard the voice. It came from behind them, from the direction of the stairwell they had just climbed. A woman's voice, professional and authoritative, calling out medical instructions as if she were directing an emergency response. "We need 2 units of O negative in room 302. Dr. Patterson to surgery. Stat. Nurse Williams, please prep the patient in 318 for immediate transport." The voice was clear, distinct, and completely impossible. There was no one else in the building. There had been no one else in the building for 7 years. The 4 teenagers ran. They ran down the stairs through the 2nd floor, past the surgery suite with its mysterious list of names, down to the ground floor, and out through the broken window they had entered. They didn't stop running until they reached the main street of Wrangell, where the streetlights and the normal sounds of evening traffic reminded them that the world they knew still existed. Sarah never spoke about her experience in detail for over 20 years. When she finally did, she had become a nurse herself, working at the new Wrangell Medical Center. She said that her experience in the old hospital had convinced her to pursue a medical career, though she could never fully explain why. The abandoned hospital was finally demolished in 1987, 5 years after Sarah's encounter. The demolition crew reported several unusual incidents during the destruction process. Equipment would malfunction without explanation. Workers reported hearing voices and footsteps in sections of the building that had already been cleared. One worker claimed he saw figures in hospital gowns watching the demolition from windows that had already been removed. Today, the site where Wrangell General Hospital once stood is a small park with a memorial plaque honoring the medical professionals who served the community during the building's 23 years of operation. Local residents sometimes report unusual phenomena in the park, particularly on foggy nights when visibility is limited. Children playing in the park have been heard having conversations with invisible playmates, describing games with the sick kids who only appear when adults aren't watching. Dog walkers report that their pets often refuse to cross certain areas of the park, instead walking in wide circles around invisible obstacles. And on the anniversary of the hospital's closing each year, some Wrangell residents claim they can still hear the sound of footsteps in the park, walking. Same patterns that once connected patient rooms, surgery suites, and the places where life and death made their eternal negotiations in the fluorescent-lit corridors of healing and hope. Story 4. The Howling of Hooper Bay. Hooper Bay sits on the western coast of Alaska, where the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta meets the Bering Sea. It's a village of just over 1,000 Yupik residents, accessible only by boat or small aircraft, connected to the outside world by a single gravel airstrip and the ancient rhythms of subsistence living that have sustained the community for thousands of years. In this remote corner of Alaska, where the nearest town is over 100 miles away, unusual sounds carry special significance. The wind speaks in different voices depending on the season. Ice makes distinct noises as it forms and breaks. Even the calls of migrating birds follow predictable patterns that experienced hunters can read like a calendar. But in the winter of 1989, Hooper Bay residents began hearing a sound that fit no pattern in their extensive knowledge of the Arctic soundscape. It started on a January night when the temperature had dropped to 28 below zero. Robert Kaganek, a 54-year-old subsistence hunter and respected village elder, was checking his fish traps along the Hooper Bay River when he first heard it. The sound came from somewhere behind him, from the direction of the village. But it was unlike anything he had ever heard in his decades of living on the Alaskan tundra. It was a howl, deep and resonant, lasting for nearly 30 seconds before fading into silence. But it wasn't the howl of a wolf, which Robert knew as well as his own voice. Wolf howls have a musical quality, a wild beauty that speaks of pack communication and territorial claims. This sound was different. It was lower in pitch, more guttural, and carried an undertone of something that Robert could only describe as grief. Robert paused in his work, listening carefully for the sound to repeat. The night was clear and calm, with the kind of Arctic silence that allows sounds to carry for miles across the frozen landscape. He waited for nearly 10 minutes, but the howl didn't come again. Eventually, he finished checking his traps and returned to the village, convinced that he had heard a wolf with an unusual voice, perhaps an old or injured animal. But over the next 3 nights, the howl returned, always at approximately the same time, always lasting for the same duration, always carrying that same note of profound sadness that made Robert's skin crawl despite his lifelong familiarity with the sounds of the wilderness. On the 4th night, Robert wasn't alone when the howl echoed across the tundra. His nephew Paul was with him, helping to reset traps that had been disturbed by scavenging foxes. When the sound began, both men froze immediately, their heads turning toward the source of the noise. "What is that?" Paul whispered, his voice barely audible above the howl that seemed to fill the entire landscape. Robert had no answer. In all his years of hunting and trapping, he had never heard anything like it. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if it were being reflected off invisible surfaces or generated by something much larger than any animal he could imagine. When the howl finally faded, it was followed by something even more disturbing, the sound of something large moving through the snow, not the quick, light footsteps of wolves or caribou, but heavy, deliberate movements that suggested an animal of enormous size. The sounds were coming closer to their position. Robert and Paul gathered their equipment as quietly as possible and began moving back toward the village. They had traveled less than 50 yards when they saw it. The creature was positioned on a small rise approximately 200 yards away, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Even at that distance, it was clear that this was not a wolf or any other animal they recognized. It stood on its hind legs like a human, but was much taller, easily 7 or 8 feet in height. Its proportions were wrong for a human, with arms that hung nearly to the ground and a torso that seemed too broad for its height. Most disturbing was its posture. It stood perfectly still, facing in their direction, as if it were watching them. There was an intelligence in that stillness, a deliberate quality that suggested the creature was assessing them, just as they were trying to understand what they were seeing. Robert had heard stories from his grandmother about creatures that walked the boundary between human and animal, beings that existed in the space between the physical and spiritual worlds. But those were old stories, traditional tales meant to teach lessons about respecting the wilderness and understanding one's place in the natural order. He had never expected to encounter such. Being in his own lifetime, the creature remained motionless for nearly 5 minutes. Then, without warning, it threw back its head and released another of those bone-chilling howls. At this closer distance, Robert and Paul could hear additional qualities in the sound that hadn't been apparent from farther away. There were harmonic frequencies that seemed almost like words, as if the creature were trying to communicate in some primitive language. When the howl ended, the creature dropped to all fours and disappeared into the darkness with surprising speed. Robert and Paul waited for several more minutes before continuing their return to the village, constantly looking over their shoulders to ensure they weren't being followed. Word of their encounter spread quickly through Hooper Bay's small community. Other residents came forward with their own experiences. Sarah Nanang reported seeing a large, upright figure walking along the shoreline during a recent storm, moving against wind that was strong enough to knock down grown men. Tommy Kanguk found tracks in the snow near his fish camp, impressions that were clearly made by something walking on two legs, but with feet much larger than any human. Most disturbing were the reports from parents whose children had begun having nightmares. Multiple families reported that their children were waking up screaming, claiming that something was looking through their windows at night. The children described a face that was almost human but covered with dark fur, with eyes that reflected light like those of a nocturnal animal. The sightings continued throughout the winter. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to follow a pattern of behavior that brought it close to the village every few nights. It would appear on the outskirts of the community, release its mournful howl, and then disappear back into the wilderness. Sometimes it was seen standing upright, observing the village from a distance. Other times it was glimpsed moving through the shadows between buildings, always staying just out of direct sight. Local elder Mary Charles consulted with other respected community members and traditional knowledge holders from neighboring villages. Their consensus was troubling. While Yupik oral tradition included stories of creatures that could take both human and animal forms, these beings were generally associated with specific locations or particular spiritual imbalances. The appearance of such a creature near Hooper Bay suggested that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between the community and the surrounding wilderness. The most frightening encounter occurred in early March, just as the winter darkness was beginning to give way to longer periods of daylight. James Kanguk, Robert's cousin, was traveling by snowmobile to check a trapline when his machine broke down approximately 5 miles from the village. As he worked to repair the engine, he became aware that he was being watched. The creature was standing less than 50 feet away, partially concealed behind a cluster of stunted willows. At this close distance, James could see details that previous witnesses had missed. The creature's face was indeed almost human in structure, but covered with coarse, dark hair. Its eyes were larger than human eyes and reflected the light from James's headlamp with an amber glow. Most unsettling was its expression, which seemed to convey a mixture of curiosity and sadness, as if it were trying to understand something about the human it was observing. The creature and James watched each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, without any warning or threatening behavior, the creature simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the landscape with the fluid grace of something perfectly adapted to its environment. James managed to repair his snowmobile and return to the village, but he was profoundly shaken by the encounter. He described, feeling that he had been evaluated by an intelligence that was neither human nor entirely animal, something that existed in a category he had no words to describe. As spring arrived and the tundra began its brief transformation from white to green, the sightings became less frequent. The creature's howls were heard only occasionally, and always from much greater distances. By summer, when the midnight sun made concealment nearly impossible, the encounters stopped entirely. But the effects of that winter lingered in Hooper Bay long after the creature disappeared. Children who had experienced the nightmares continued to have trouble sleeping. Adults found themselves listening more carefully to night sounds, trying to distinguish between the familiar calls of wolves and the possibility that something else might be communicating across the tundra. Robert Kaganak continued his subsistence activities for many more years, but he never again ventured far from the village alone after dark. When asked about his experience, He would describe what he had seen with the matter-of-fact tone that Alaskan natives use when discussing encounters with the spiritual aspects of their environment. But he would also emphasize that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, and that not all questions have answers that humans are meant to understand. Today, over 30 years after the winter of the Howling, Hooper Bay residents still occasionally report unusual sounds coming from the tundra. New generations of children sometimes wake from nightmares, featuring a creature that watches them from outside their windows. And on the clearest winter nights, when the wind is calm and sounds carry for miles across the frozen landscape, some residents claim they can still hear that distinctive howl echoing across the wilderness, carrying its message of loneliness and longing to anyone brave enough to listen. Story 5. The Night the Ocean Froze in Seldovia. Seldovia perches on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, like a collection of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of the world. With barely 300 residents, it's the kind of place where the ocean isn't just a backdrop to daily life. It's the foundation of existence itself. Fishing boats bring in the harvest that feeds families and supports the local economy. The tide schedule governs when boats can enter and leave the harbor. The sea is a living, breathing entity that every resident knows as intimately as their own heartbeat, which is why what happened on the night of February 14th, 1991 was so deeply unsettling to anyone who witnessed it. Captain Eric Nordheim had been fishing the waters around Seldovia for over 20 years. At 48, he was considered one of the most experienced mariners in the region, someone who could read weather patterns and ocean conditions with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. His 36-foot fishing vessel, the Northern Star, was a familiar sight in Seldovia Bay, returning each evening loaded with halibut, salmon, or crab depending on the season. On that February evening, Eric was returning from a day of winter crab fishing with his crew of 3. His son Michael, age 22, and 2 longtime crew members, Pete Larson and Jimmy Martinez. The weather had been challenging, but manageable, with temperatures hovering around 15 degrees and light snow falling intermittently throughout the day. At approximately 9:30 p.m., as they approached Seldovia Bay, Eric noticed something unusual about the water around his boat. The ocean, which had been displaying normal wave action and tidal movement throughout the day, appeared to be slowing down. At first, he thought it might be an optical illusion caused by the falling snow, or perhaps ice crystals forming on his windshield, affecting his vision. But as they drew closer to the harbor, it became clear that something extraordinary was happening to the water itself. The waves weren't just calming down, they were actually stopping. Eric watched in fascination as individual waves simply halted their forward motion, suspended in mid-crest, as if someone had pressed a pause button on the entire ocean. The Northern Star continued moving forward under its own power, but the water around them was becoming increasingly still, losing the constant motion that defines ocean water even on the calmest days. "Dad, are you seeing this?" Michael called from the bow of the boat, his voice carrying a note of bewilderment that Eric had never heard from his normally unflappable son. Eric was seeing it, but he wasn't believing it. In 2 decades of commercial fishing, he had witnessed unusual weather phenomena, freak tides, and unexpected ice formations, but he had never seen the ocean itself simply stop moving. Water, by its very nature, is in constant motion. Even in the most protected harbors, there are always currents, always subtle movements caused by temperature differences, wind patterns, or tidal forces. As they entered Seldovia Bay, the unnatural stillness became even more pronounced. The water looked like dark glass, perfectly smooth and reflective despite the falling snow. Their boat's wake, which should have spread out behind them in the familiar V pattern, simply stopped a few feet from their stern. As if the water were refusing to be disturbed, Pete Larson, who had been fishing these waters for 30 years, grabbed Eric's arm. "Captain, this ain't right. Water don't behave like this. Something's wrong." Eric reduced their speed to just above idle, partly out of caution and partly because he was afraid that moving too quickly through whatever was happening might somehow make the situation worse. As they approached the main dock, they could see other boats that had returned earlier in the evening. These vessels were sitting in the harbor as if they were in dry dock, perfectly motionless despite being afloat. More disturbing was the silence. Ocean water, even when calm, produces a constant background of small sounds, gentle lapping against hulls, the subtle creaking of boats responding to minor water movement, the soft gurgling of water around pilings and dock structures. All of these familiar sounds had stopped. The harbor was as quiet as a mountain lake on a windless day. As Eric maneuvered the Northern Star toward their usual berth, they encountered something that would haunt all four men for the rest of their lives. The water around the dock wasn't just still, it was actually beginning to show signs of surface freezing, despite being salt water, in temperatures that were well above the freezing point of seawater. Thin sheets of ice were forming in geometric patterns across the surface of the harbor, creating designs that looked almost deliberately crafted rather than randomly generated by natural freezing processes. The ice formed in perfect hexagons, each about 3 feet across, connecting to adjacent hexagons with mathematical precision. "That's impossible," Jimmy Martinez whispered, staring at the ice formations. "Salt water don't freeze like that, and it sure don't freeze in patterns." Eric had to agree. Seawater freezes at approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air temperature was around 15 degrees. But seawater doesn't freeze uniformly or in geometric patterns. It forms rough, irregular ice that reflects the chaotic nature of wave action and salinity variations. What they were seeing looked more like the kind of ice that forms on fresh water under controlled laboratory conditions. As they tied up at the dock, they noticed other fishermen standing on the pier, all of them staring at the impossible scene in their harbor. Captain Roy Svensson approached them, his face pale despite the cold weather. "Eric, how long has it been like this out there?" Roy asked, gesturing toward the bay. "Started about 20 minutes ago," Eric replied. "Water just stopped moving. Never seen anything like it." Roy nodded grimly. "Same here. My boat's been sitting dead still for the last hour. No movement at all. And listen to this." He led them to the edge of the dock and pointed down at the water. "You hear that?" Eric listened carefully. At first, he heard nothing, which was itself strange enough. But as he concentrated, he began to detect a sound that seemed to come from beneath the ice-covered surface of the harbor. It was a rhythmic noise, like something heavy being dragged across a hard surface. The sound was muffled by the water and ice, but it was definitely mechanical in nature, as if some kind of machinery were operating on the ocean floor. "Sounds like chains," Michael observed, and Eric realized his son was right. It did sound like chains, heavy chains being pulled across rocks or metal. But the harbor at Seldovia was over 40 feet deep in most places, and there was no machinery on the bottom that could generate such sounds. The sound continued for approximately 20 minutes, always maintaining the same rhythm, always seeming to come from directly beneath the geometric ice formations. Then, without warning, it stopped. What happened next was even more unsettling than the unnatural stillness that had preceded it. The ice formations began to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light. Not the kind of bioluminescence that sometimes occurs in ocean water due to microscopic organisms, but a steady, artificial-seeming illumination that outlined each hexagonal ice pattern in pale blue light. The glow lasted for exactly 3 minutes, as several of the witnesses later confirmed by checking their watches. Then the light faded. The geometric ice patterns began to break apart. and the water in Seldovia Harbor slowly resumed its normal movement. Within 10 minutes, the harbor looked completely normal again. Boats began to rock gently with the returning wave action. The familiar sounds of water against hulls and dock structures resumed. The temperature of the water, when tested the next day, showed no unusual readings, but one boat was missing. The Sarah's Dream, a 28-foot fishing vessel owned by Captain Dave Kowalski, had been moored at the far end of the harbor when the strange phenomena began. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing the boat in its usual slip when the water first began to still. But when normal conditions returned, the Sarah's Dream was gone. The boat was never found. Coast Guard search planes combed thousands of square miles of ocean over the following weeks, but no trace of the vessel or its crew was ever discovered. Dave Kowalski, his brother Tom, and crew member Steve Paulson had simply vanished, along with their boat, during the 20 minutes when Seldovia Harbor had become as still as a frozen pond. The official Coast Guard report attributed the loss of the Sarah's Dream to severe weather conditions and possible mechanical failure. The strange behavior of the water in the harbor was noted in several witness statements, but was not included in the final report's conclusions. Eric Nordheim continued fishing out of Seldovia for another 15 years before retiring. He never spoke publicly about what happened that February night, but he did make one significant change to his routine. He never again stayed out past sunset during the winter months, always ensuring that the Northern Star was safely tied up at the dock before darkness fell. Other Seldovia residents who witnessed the event developed similar habits. The harbor, which had once been active well into the evening hours during fishing season, began to empty out before dark. Fishermen who had previously thought nothing of working late into the night suddenly found reasons to return to port before sunset. Today, 30 years after that strange February night, Seldovia's harbor operates normally. Fishing boats come and go according to the rhythms of tides and weather. The water moves as water should move, responding to wind and current in predictable patterns. But longtime residents still avoid looking too closely at the harbor on calm winter nights when the water is unusually still, and when the temperature drops well below freezing and geometric ice patterns begin to form on the surface of the bay. Many choose to stay indoors rather than witness whatever might be moving beneath the frozen surface of their small corner of the sea. Story 6. The Teacher Who Walked into the Blizzard. Barrow Utqiagvik. Barrow, now known as Utqiagvik, sits at the northernmost point of Alaska, 330 miles above the Arctic Circle. It's a place where the sun doesn't rise for 65 days in winter and doesn't set for 65 days in summer, where the thermometer can read 40 below zero on a calm day, and where survival depends on community cooperation and respect for the unforgiving Arctic environment. In this harsh landscape, teachers hold a special place in the community. They bring knowledge and hope to children growing up at the literal edge of the world, connecting young minds to possibilities that exist far beyond the frozen tundra. Which is why the disappearance of Margaret Chen in November of 1988 struck the community with particular force. Margaret had arrived in Barrow just 2 months earlier, a 26-year-old elementary school teacher from California who had been drawn to Alaska by a combination of adventure-seeking and a genuine desire to make a difference in the lives of Native Alaskan children. Despite her lack of Arctic experience, she had adapted quickly to the extreme conditions, earning the respect of both her students and the veteran teachers who had initially worried about her ability to handle the isolation and harsh weather. The school where Margaret taught served children from kindergarten through 6th grade, many of whom lived in the scattered buildings that made up Barrow's residential areas. During the winter months, when temperatures regularly dropped to 40 or 50 below zero, and winds could create whiteout conditions in minutes, getting children safely to and from school became a community-wide responsibility. November 18, 1988, started as a relatively mild day for northern Alaska, with temperatures around -15 degrees and light winds. Margaret had taught her usual classes, spending extra time with several students who were struggling with reading comprehension. She was known for her dedication, often staying after school to help individual children or to prepare special lessons that incorporated traditional Inupiat culture with standard curriculum requirements. At approximately 4:30 p.m., as the brief Arctic daylight was fading into the long polar night, Margaret left the school building to walk the 3 blocks to her small apartment. Several colleagues saw her, bundling up in her heavy parka, checking that her face mask and gloves were properly secured against the cold. She waved goodbye to Principal Robert Ockinga and stepped out into the Arctic evening. Margaret never reached her apartment. When she failed to answer her phone that evening, Principal Ockinga wasn't immediately concerned. The phone system in Barrow was notoriously unreliable, and it wasn't unusual for calls to fail to connect during periods of high wind or atmospheric disturbance. But when Margaret didn't appear at school the following morning, concern quickly turned to alarm. A search party was organized immediately. In a community like Barrow, where everyone's survival depends on looking out for each other, the disappearance of any resident triggers an automatic response. Within hours, teams of searchers were combing every possible route between the school and Margaret's apartment, checking every building where she might have taken shelter, questioning every resident who might have seen her the previous evening. The search revealed something troubling. Margaret's footprints were clearly visible in the snow, leading away from the school in the direction of her apartment. But after 2 blocks, the footprints made an abrupt turn away from the residential area and headed directly toward the open tundra that stretches endlessly north of the town. This change of direction made no sense. Margaret had walked the route to her apartment dozens of times over the past 2 months. Even in the dark, even in harsh weather conditions, she knew the way. There was no reason for her to suddenly veer off into the wilderness, especially not into terrain that she, as a newcomer to the Arctic, knew could be deadly to anyone without extensive survival experience. The footprints continued in a straight line across the tundra for over a mile before they were obscured by fresh snow that had fallen during the night. Search teams followed the trail as far as they could, but it led directly into the kind of featureless landscape where people can become hopelessly lost within minutes, where the combination of extreme cold and disorientation can kill even experienced Arctic travelers. As the search expanded, more puzzling details emerged. Several residents reported that they had heard children's voices on the night of Margaret's disappearance. The sound of young people laughing and playing outside, despite the harsh weather, and the fact that responsible parents keep their children indoors after dark during the Arctic winter. Mary Kanguk, who lived along Margaret's normal route home, said she had looked out her window around 5:00 p.m. and seen what appeared to be several children playing in the snow near the edge of town. This was unusual enough that she had considered going outside to make sure the children were safe. But when she looked again a few minutes later, they were gone. Other residents reported similar sightings. Children's voices calling and laughing in the darkness. The sounds of games being played in areas where no children should have been present. Most disturbing were reports from parents who said they had heard their own children's voices outside, calling for them to join in some kind of outdoor activity, even though their children were safely inside the house at the time. The search for Margaret continued for weeks, expanding to cover hundreds of square miles of Arctic tundra. Bush pilots flew search patterns over the frozen landscape. Teams of volunteers on snowmobiles followed every possible route she might have taken. Traditional Inupiat hunters, whose knowledge of the land went back generations, joined the effort, bringing their intimate understanding of how the Arctic environment can affect human behavior and survival. No trace of Margaret was ever found. No additional footprints, no pieces of clothing, no signs that she had built a shelter or attempted to signal for help. She had simply walked into the wilderness and vanished as completely as if she had never existed. But her disappearance marked the beginning of a series of strange occurrences that would plague Barrow for years to come. Within a month of Margaret's disappearance, several residents reported seeing lights in her apartment, despite the fact that the building had been locked and secured. The lights would appear in the evening, around the time when Margaret would normally have been returning from school, and they would remain on for exactly the duration of a typical evening routine before going dark again. Building maintenance staff confirmed that the electricity had been shut off to Margaret's apartment immediately after her disappearance. There was no possible source for the lights that residents continued to report seeing. Yet the phenomena persisted, always following the same pattern, always occurring at times that corresponded to Margaret's former daily schedule. More unsettling were the reports from the school itself. Margaret's classroom, room 14, began to show signs of activity despite being officially closed and locked. Janitors reported finding evidence that someone had been using the room. Chalk marks on the blackboard, papers arranged on desks, children's books left open to specific pages, as if someone had been reading to an audience. The principal had the lock changed twice, but the mysterious activity continued. Security checks of the building showed no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had gained unauthorized access to the school. Yet Margaret's classroom continued to show signs of use, as if classes were being conducted by an invisible teacher for students who existed only in memory. The most disturbing reports came from parents whose children had been in Margaret's class. Several families reported that their children had begun having conversations with Miss Margaret during their sleep, speaking aloud to someone who wasn't there, answering questions as if they were participating in a lesson. When asked about these nighttime conversations, the children would describe in detail discussions about reading, arithmetic, and Inupiat cultural traditions that Margaret had been incorporating into her lessons. They spoke about Miss Margaret with the present tense, as if she were still their teacher, still coming to school every day to work with them. One child, 8-year-old Tommy Ockinga, provided the most chilling account. He told his parents that Miss Margaret had explained to him why she had to leave the school that night. According to Tommy, she had heard children calling for help from out on the tundra, children who were lost and needed a teacher to guide them home. She had followed their voices into the wilderness to bring them back to safety. She's still out there, Tommy told his parents, with the matter-of-fact certainty that children sometimes display when discussing things adults find impossible to accept. She's teaching the lost children until someone comes to bring them all home. The phenomena associated with Margaret's disappearance continued for several years. Lights in her abandoned apartment, activity in her locked classroom, children's conversations with their missing teacher. Gradually, the incidents became less frequent, but they never completely stopped. Today, over 30 years after Margaret Chen walked into an Arctic blizzard and vanished, Room 14 at the Barrow School is still occasionally used for classes, but it's never assigned to first-year teachers and veteran educators who work in the room report an unusual sense of being watched, as if someone is observing their teaching methods and taking notes for future reference. On the coldest winter nights, when the wind howls across the tundra and the aurora borealis dances in sheets of green light across the Arctic sky, some Barrow residents still report hearing the sound of children's laughter carried on the wind. And those with the keenest hearing claim they can detect an adult voice among the children's voices, a teacher's voice patiently explaining lessons that will help guide lost souls safely home through the endless darkness of the Arctic night. Story 7. The Thing in the Tunnels of Juneau. Juneau, Alaska's capital city, sits nestled between the Gastineau Channel and the steep slopes of Mount Juneau and Mount Roberts. With a population of just over 30,000, it's a city built into the landscape rather than on top of it, where buildings cling to hillsides and downtown streets follow the natural contours of the mountains. But beneath this picturesque surface lies a hidden network of tunnels that most residents don't know exists, remnants of a time when Juneau played a crucial role in America's wartime preparations. During World War II, as fears of Japanese invasion gripped the Pacific Northwest, military engineers constructed an extensive system of underground tunnels beneath downtown Juneau. These tunnels were designed to serve multiple purposes: storage for critical supplies, secure communication centers, and emergency shelters for government officials if the city came under attack. The tunnel system stretched for nearly 2 miles, connecting key government buildings and extending deep into the mountainside, where natural caves provided additional storage space. After the war ended, the tunnels were gradually abandoned. Some sections were sealed off for security reasons. Others were simply forgotten as new construction and changing city layouts made the entrances inaccessible. By the 1960s, most city employees weren't even aware that the tunnel system existed, and those who knew about it assumed it was empty and harmless. In 1979, that assumption was challenged when the city hired a new maintenance supervisor named Robert McKenzie. Robert was a practical man in his 50s, a veteran of the Korean War who had moved to Alaska seeking a quiet job where he could use his technical skills without dealing with the stress and politics he'd experienced in his previous positions in Seattle and Portland. One of Robert's responsibilities was maintaining the heating and electrical systems for several downtown government buildings. During his first month on the job, he discovered that some of these systems connected to tunnels that appeared on no current city maps. When he asked his supervisor about the tunnels, he was told they were old wartime stuff and that he should just make sure the utility connections were working properly. Robert approached his job methodically, mapping the tunnel system as he encountered it and documenting the locations of electrical panels, heating equipment, and other infrastructure that required regular maintenance. Most of the tunnels were exactly what he expected: concrete corridors with utilitarian lighting, lined with pipes and cables, smelling of damp concrete and old machinery. But some sections of the tunnel system were different. The first anomaly Robert noticed was in a section that extended eastward from the basement of the federal building. This part of the tunnel system was older than the World War II construction, carved directly into the rock of the mountainside with techniques that suggested much earlier origin. The walls showed tool marks that looked like they had been made by hand tools rather than modern machinery, and the construction style was different from the military engineering evident in other sections. More puzzling was the fact that this older section of tunnel showed signs of recent use despite being officially abandoned for over 30 years. Robert found footprints in the dust, not the random marks that might be left by maintenance workers or curious explorers, but deliberate tracks that suggested someone was using these tunnels regularly, following specific routes through the underground network. The footprints were unusual in several ways. They were much larger than normal human footprints, easily size 15 or 16, but with a shape that didn't match any work boot or shoe that Robert had ever seen. The impressions showed what appeared to be bare feet with unusually long toes, and the stride length suggested someone much taller than average. Even more disturbing was the pattern of the tracks. Instead of following the most direct routes through the tunnels, the footprints wandered seemingly at random, doubling back on themselves, following circular patterns that made no logical sense for someone trying to move efficiently through the underground system. Robert documented his findings and reported them to his supervisor, but was told not to worry about old footprints and to focus on his maintenance responsibilities. The attitude seemed to be that whatever had left the tracks was harmless and not worth investigating further. But Robert's concern increased as he continued to work in the tunnels over the following months. The footprints weren't old. New ones appeared regularly, always following the same wandering patterns, always showing the same unusual size and shape characteristics. Whatever was making these tracks was still active in the tunnel system. In November of 1979, Robert had his first direct encounter with whatever was sharing the underground space beneath Juneau. He was working alone in the eastern section of the tunnel system, replacing some electrical fixtures that had been damaged by water leakage. It was late afternoon, and he was planning to finish the job and return to the surface before the end of his shift. The work was routine, requiring concentration, but not presenting any particular challenges. As he worked, Robert became gradually aware that he was hearing sounds from deeper in the tunnel system. At first, he assumed the noises were caused by settling building foundations or changes in water pressure affecting the pipe systems. But as he listened more carefully, he realized the sounds had a rhythm and pattern that suggested deliberate activity. Someone or something was moving through the tunnels in a regular pattern, following routes that Robert had learned from studying the footprint evidence. The sounds included footsteps, but also other noises that Robert couldn't identify. Scraping sounds, as if something were being dragged along the tunnel walls, and occasional impacts, as if heavy objects were being moved or rearranged. Robert finished his electrical work as quickly as possible and began making his way back toward the main tunnel system that led to the surface. But as he walked, he realized that the sounds were getting closer, as if whatever was making them was following a route that would intersect with his own path back to the exit. At a junction where 3 tunnels met, Robert decided to wait and see what was approaching. He turned off his work light and stood quietly in the darkness, listening to the sounds that were now close enough to identify more clearly. What he heard defied easy categorization. The footsteps were definitely being made by something walking on 2 legs. But the gait was wrong for a human. The steps were too far apart, suggesting something much taller than normal. And there was a dragging quality to each footfall, as if the walker had difficulty lifting its feet completely off the ground. Mixed with the footsteps were sounds that Robert could only describe as vocalizations. Not words, not even recognizable attempts at human speech, but a kind of muttering or mumbling that rose and fell in pitch, like someone having a conversation with themselves. The voice, if it could be called that, was deep and resonant, with harmonics that suggested it was coming from something with a much larger chest cavity than a normal human. The sounds reached the junction where Robert was hiding and then stopped. In the complete darkness of the underground tunnel, Robert could hear breathing that wasn't his own, slow and deep, as if whatever had been walking through the tunnels was now standing just a few feet away from him, listening and perhaps trying to locate his position. Robert held his breath and remained completely motionless. The breathing continued for what felt like several minutes, accompanied by occasional sniffing sounds, as if something were trying to identify his scent. Then, without warning, there was a sound that Robert would never forget. A low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to combine curiosity with something that might have been amusement. The breathing moved away from Robert's position, heading deeper into the tunnel system, toward areas that he had never explored. The footsteps resumed, still following that unusual dragging pattern, gradually fading as whatever had been investigating his presence moved farther into the underground maze. Robert waited in the darkness for nearly an hour before finally turning his light back on and making his way to the surface. He filed a detailed report of his experience, but was again told not to worry about strange noises in the tunnels and to focus on his maintenance duties. Over the following months, Robert continued to encounter evidence of the tunnel's mysterious inhabitant. Tools would be moved from where he had left them, always in ways that suggested they had been examined by something with limited understanding of their purpose. Handprints appeared on tunnel walls, pressed into accumulated dust and grime, showing fingers that were much longer than human fingers, and a palm that was disproportionately large. Most disturbing were the construction projects that Robert discovered in the deepest sections of the tunnel system. Someone or something was modifying the tunnels, creating new passages and chambers using techniques that combined crude manual labor with an understanding of structural engineering that shouldn't have been possible for whatever was living underground. The new construction showed the same oversized handprints that Robert had found elsewhere in the tunnels. But the work itself demonstrated a level of planning and skill that suggested intelligence far beyond what the primitive vocalizations and wandering footprint patterns would indicate. Robert continued working in the Juneau tunnel system for 3 more years before requesting a transfer to surface maintenance duties. He never again encountered the tunnel's inhabitant directly, but he continued to find evidence of its presence. Modified passages, rearranged equipment, and always those distinctive footprints wandering through the underground darkness. When Robert retired in 1987, he attempted to interest city officials in conducting a thorough investigation of the tunnel system, but was told that budget constraints made such an undertaking impossible. The tunnels were officially sealed in 1989, with most of the entrances being permanently blocked with concrete. But sealing the tunnels didn't end the strange phenomena beneath Juneau. Construction workers digging foundations for new downtown buildings occasionally report hearing sounds from underground. Footsteps, vocalizations, and the noise of ongoing construction activity. Building inspectors sometimes find that basement walls show signs of pressure from behind, as if something were pushing against them from underground spaces that aren't supposed to exist. And late at night, when downtown Juneau is quiet and the sounds of traffic and human activity have faded, residents of buildings above the old tunnel system sometimes report hearing a deep, rumbling voice speaking in patterns that sound almost like language, carrying on conversations in the darkness beneath their feet with invisible companions who respond in voices too faint to understand. Story 8. The Creeping Fog of Cordova. Cordova sits at the mouth of the Copper River, where one of Alaska's most important salmon runs meets Prince William Sound. It's a town built around fishing, where the rhythms of daily life follow the movements of salmon, herring, and halibut through waters that have supported human communities for thousands of years. With just over 2,000 residents, Cordova maintains the tight-knit character of a place where everyone's livelihood depends on reading the ocean's moods and respecting its power. In such a community, experienced fishermen develop an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns, ocean conditions, and the behavior of fog banks that roll in from the Gulf of Alaska. They can tell by the color of the water, the behavior of seabirds, and subtle changes in wind direction when conditions are about to shift. It's knowledge passed down through generations, refined by decades of experience, and tested daily by the unforgiving. realities of commercial fishing, which is why the events of August 15th, 1994, were so profoundly unsettling to Cordova's fishing community. Captain Maria Santos had been fishing the waters around Prince William Sound for 18 years. At 39, she was one of the most respected skippers in Cordova, known for her ability to find fish when others came back empty-handed, and for her uncanny skill at avoiding the dangerous weather that could appear without warning in Alaskan waters. On that August morning, Maria set out from Cordova Harbor with her crew of 4 aboard the Ocean's Gift, a 42-foot seiner that she had owned and operated for over a decade. The weather forecast called for clear skies and light winds, perfect conditions for the kind of salmon fishing that made August one of the most profitable months for Cordova's fleet. The day started exactly as predicted: clear skies, calm seas, and salmon running in numbers that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Early afternoon, the Ocean's Gift had nearly filled its hold with pink and chum salmon, and Maria was considering calling it a day despite the excellent fishing conditions. At approximately 2:30 p.m., as they were hauling in their nets for what Maria intended to be their final set, crew member Jake Morrison called her attention to something unusual on the horizon. A fog bank was approaching from the southwest, rolling across Prince William Sound with unusual speed and uniformity. Fog was common in these waters, especially during summer months when temperature differences between warm air and cold ocean water created ideal conditions for fog formation. But this fog bank was different in several ways that immediately caught Maria's experienced eye. First, it was moving against the wind. The prevailing breeze was coming from the northwest, but the fog was advancing from the southwest at a steady pace that defied the normal relationship between wind patterns and fog movement. Second, it had sharply defined edges, forming a wall of gray mist that stretched across the entire visible horizon rather than the irregular, shifting boundaries typical of natural fog formations. Most unusually, the fog appeared to be glowing from within, not with the diffuse light that sometimes occurs when fog filters sunlight, but with a steady, artificial-seeming illumination that created an eerie backdrop against the clear afternoon sky. Maria's first instinct was to head for port immediately. Fog, even under normal circumstances, posed serious navigation hazards for fishing vessels loaded with catch and operating in waters filled with other boats. But as she turned the Ocean's Gift toward Cordova, she realized that the fog bank was moving much faster than she had initially estimated. Within 15 minutes, the wall of mist had covered half the distance to their position. At its current rate of advance, it would reach them long before they could make it back to the harbor. Maria made the decision to maintain their position and wait for the fog to pass over them, a standard procedure for situations where outrunning weather phenomena wasn't possible. What happened when the fog reached the Ocean's Gift challenged everything Maria thought she knew about maritime weather patterns. As the leading edge of the fog bank enveloped their boat, the normal sounds of ocean and engine were immediately muffled to an unusual degree. Maria had been in countless fog banks during her fishing career, and she knew that fog typically reduces sound transmission, but doesn't eliminate it entirely. This fog seemed to absorb sound completely, creating a silence so profound that the crew members had difficulty hearing each other speak, despite being only a few feet apart. More disturbing was the effect on their electronic equipment. The GPS system, which had been providing accurate position readings moments before, suddenly showed their location as a series of random coordinates that placed them ... variously in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, somewhere off the coast of Japan, and at one point, apparently on dry land in central Alaska. The radar system, which should have been able to detect other vessels and shoreline features even in heavy fog, showed only a blank screen, as if they were floating in an empty ocean with no other objects within its range. Most unsettling, their radio equipment, which maintained constant contact with other fishing vessels and the Coast Guard, received only static despite being on emergency frequencies that should have carried signals from multiple sources. Jake Morrison, who was standing watch at the bow of the vessel, called back to Maria with alarm in his voice. "Captain, you need to see this. The water, it's not right." Maria made her way forward and looked over the side of the boat. The ocean around them had taken on an unusual appearance. Instead of the normal dark blue-green color typical of deep water in Prince William Sound, the sea had become perfectly black, so dark that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When Jake dropped a fishing weight overboard to test the depth, they couldn't see it disappear beneath the surface, despite the fact that the water should have been clear enough to observe objects several feet down. More unnervingly, the ocean had become completely flat, without even the small swells that normally persist even in the calmest conditions. The ocean's gift sat motionless on water that looked more like black glass than the living, breathing sea that Maria had known throughout her fishing career. As the crew tried to make sense of their situation, they began to notice other anomalies. The temperature had dropped significantly, not the gradual cooling that typically accompanies fog, but a sudden chill that seemed to penetrate their clothing, despite the fact that moments earlier they had been working comfortably in t-shirts. The fog itself seemed to have texture, not the wispy, flowing quality of normal mist, but a density that felt almost solid when they moved through it. Crew member Lisa Chang reported that when she reached out her hand, the fog seemed to push back against her palm as if it had physical substance. Most disturbing was the discovery that their sense of time had become unreliable. What felt like minutes of drift in the fog bank corresponded to hours on their watches. When Maria checked the ship's chronometer, which had been synchronized with Coast Guard time signals that morning, it showed that nearly 6 hours had passed since the fog had first enveloped them, despite the fact that the experience seemed to have lasted less than an hour. When the fog finally began to lift, revealing clear skies and normal ocean conditions, the ocean's gift found itself in a location that defied explanation. According to their GPS, which had resumed normal operation, they were approximately 60 miles southeast of their original position, far outside the normal boundaries of Prince William Sound and in waters that Maria had never fished before. More puzzling was the condition of their catch. When they opened the fish hold to assess their salmon, they found that the entire load had vanished, not spoiled, not damaged, but completely gone, as if it had never been loaded aboard their vessel. The hold was clean and empty, showing no signs that it had ever contained thousands of pounds of fresh fish. The crew's personal belongings had also been affected. Watches, jewelry, and electronic devices showed signs of corrosion that would normally take months of saltwater exposure to develop. Jake's compass had been permanently demagnetized, spinning randomly without indicating any consistent direction. Maria radioed the Coast Guard to report their position and request assistance in returning to Cordova. The response was immediate and concerned. According to Coast Guard records, the Ocean's Gift had been missing for over 18 hours. Search and rescue operations had been initiated when they failed to return to port at their scheduled time, and multiple vessels and aircraft had been combing Prince William Sound looking for any sign of their boat. The official Coast Guard report attributed the Ocean's Gift's disappearance to equipment malfunction and navigation error, resulting in temporary disorientation. The loss of their catch was explained as possible jettisoning of cargo during emergency conditions, but other Cordova fishermen who heard Maria's account recognized something that the official investigation had missed. Similar incidents had occurred before, always involving encounters with unusual fog banks that moved against prevailing wind patterns and displayed the same artificial luminescence that Maria had described. Captain Roy Hendricks, who had been fishing Alaskan waters for over 30 years, came forward with his own story of a fog encounter that had occurred 15 years earlier. He described the same black water, the same equipment malfunctions, and the same time distortion that had left his vessel missing for nearly 2 days, while the crew experienced what felt like only a few hours. Other fishermen shared similar accounts, always reluctantly and only when pressed by colleagues who had experienced comparable phenomena. The pattern was consistent: fog banks that behaved in ways that defied meteorological explanation, time distortions that left crews missing for extended periods, and the complete disappearance of catch that had been securely stored before the fog encounters. More disturbing were the reports from fishing vessels that had returned from fog encounters without their crews. 3 times over the past 20 years, boats had been found drifting empty in Prince William Sound, their engines still running, their fishing equipment still deployed, but with no sign of the men and women who had been operating them. In each case, the boats showed the same signs of corrosion that Maria's crew had experienced, and their electronic equipment had been permanently damaged in ways that suggested exposure to some form of intense electromagnetic field. Today, nearly 30 years after Maria Santos and her crew emerged from that impossible fog bank, Cordova fishermen have developed informal protocols for dealing with unusual weather formations. When fog banks are spotted moving against the wind or displaying internal luminescence, fishing vessels immediately return to port rather than risk encounter with phenomena that remain beyond scientific explanation. The Coast Guard maintains no official position on these reports, but experienced rescue personnel privately acknowledge that certain areas of Prince William Sound seem to be associated with higher than normal rates of fishing vessel disappearances, always during periods of unusual fog activity, and on summer afternoons when conditions are perfect for fishing, but strange mists begin to form on the horizon. Cordova's harbor fills with boats returning early from what should have been profitable days on the water, their crews unwilling to risk encountering the fog that swallows time itself and returns vessels empty of everything except questions that no one wants to answer. Story 9. The Cannery Shadows of Ketchikan. Ketchikan clings to the mountainous shores of Revillagigedo Island, like a collection of weathered buildings, defying gravity itself. Known as the salmon capital of the world, this southeast Alaskan town of 8,000 residents has built its identity around the massive salmon runs that pass through the surrounding waters each summer, supporting an industry that has fed communities and economies for over a century. During the peak years of the Alaska salmon industry, from the 1920s through the 1950s, Ketchikan was home to more than a dozen major canneries. These industrial complexes employed thousands of workers during the summer processing season, transforming millions of salmon into canned products that were shipped around the world. The canneries were more than just factories. They were complete communities unto themselves, with bunkhouses, mess halls, and company stores that housed and fed an army of seasonal workers who came north each year to participate in one of America's most demanding industrial operations. But by the 1960s, changes in the fishing industry, environmental regulations, and economic pressures had forced most of Ketchikan's canneries to close permanently. The massive wooden and metal structures that had once buzzed with activity 24 hours a day during salmon season were abandoned, left to the southeast Alaskan climate that could reduce even the sturdiest buildings to rotting ruins within a few decades. The old Pacific American Fisheries Cannery, built in 1912 on the north end of Ketchikan, was one of the largest and most successful of these operations. At its peak, PAF employed over 800 workers during the summer season, processing up to 50,000 salmon per day through a complex system of conveyor belts, cutting machines, and canning equipment that represented the cutting edge of early 20th century industrial technology. When PAF closed permanently in 1959, the facility was simply abandoned. The company removed the most valuable equipment, but left behind the massive infrastructure that had supported 3 decades of intensive operation. The main processing building, several warehouses, worker dormitories, and the complex dock system that had allowed fishing boats to deliver their catch directly to the cannery floor were left to decay in the relentless southeast Alaskan rain. By 1985, 26 years after its closure, the old PAF cannery had become a landmark of industrial ruin. The main building's roof had partially collapsed, allowing decades of rain to flood the processing floor, where thousands of workers had once labored through 18-hour shifts. The wooden pilings that supported the dock structures were rotting away, creating a maze of unstable walkways that extended out over Tongass Narrows like the skeleton of some prehistoric sea creature. It was in this decaying industrial monument that Gary Kowalski found employment as a night security guard in the spring of 1985. Gary was 28 years old, a former mill worker who had moved to Ketchikan after losing his job in the Pacific Northwest timber industry. The security position was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to earn money for his planned move to Anchorage, where he hoped to find work in the oil industry. The job seemed simple enough. Patrol the old cannery buildings from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Watch for vandals or scavengers looking to steal scrap metal, and file reports on any unusual activity. What Gary discovered during his first week on the job challenged his understanding of what constituted unusual activity. The old cannery was supposed to be completely empty, abandoned to weather and time. But Gary quickly realized that the buildings showed signs of recent human presence that couldn't be explained by occasional visits from vandals or urban exploration enthusiasts. In the main processing building, Gary found areas where the thick layer of dust and debris had been disturbed, in patterns that suggested organized activity, not the random disturbance that might be caused by curious visitors, but systematic clearing of specific work areas, as if someone were attempting to restore sections of the cannery to functional condition. More puzzling was the discovery of tools and equipment that appeared to be in regular use, despite the building's decades of abandonment. Hand tools were arranged in neat rows along work surfaces, showing signs of recent cleaning and maintenance. Sections of the old conveyor belt system had been cleared of debris and rust, as if someone were preparing them for operation. Most disturbing was the condition of the old cutting stations, where workers had once processed thousands of salmon each day. These areas showed signs of recent use, not for salmon processing, but for some other kind of activity that Gary couldn't identify. The cutting surfaces had been scrubbed clean, and sharp implements were arranged with the precision of someone who understood their proper use and maintenance. Gary documented these anomalies in his security reports, but his supervisor dismissed them as evidence of scavengers or homeless individuals who might be using the buildings for shelter. Gary was instructed to focus on preventing theft and vandalism rather than investigating signs of occupancy. But as Barry continued his nightly patrols over the following weeks, he began to encounter phenomena that couldn't be explained by the presence of living squatters. The first incident occurred during his 3rd week on the job. Gary was conducting his midnight patrol of the main processing building when he heard sounds that seemed to come from deep within the structure. Not the random creaking and settling noises that old buildings make, but organized sounds that suggested purposeful activity. Gary followed the sounds to their apparent source, the old fish cutting floor, where hundreds of workers had once stood shoulder to shoulder, processing salmon. With industrial efficiency, as he approached the area, the sounds became clearer and more disturbing. He was hearing the rhythmic noise of industrial work, the chunk of knives hitting cutting boards, the mechanical whir of equipment in operation, the splash of water washing away debris. But when Gary entered the cutting floor area, he found it empty and silent, showing only the same signs of recent cleaning and organization that he had noted in his previous reports. The sound stopped the moment Gary entered the space, as if his presence had interrupted whatever activity had been taking place. Gary searched the entire area with his flashlight, checking every corner and behind every piece of remaining equipment, but found no evidence of anyone else in the building. As Gary was completing his search, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Despite the fact that he had found no one else in the building, he could see fresh, wet footprints on the floor around the cutting stations. Not just one set of prints, but dozens of them, as if a large group of workers had been moving around the area just moments before his arrival. The footprints were unusual in several ways. They appeared to have been made by bare feet rather than work boots, which made no sense for people engaged in industrial labor. More disturbing was their size and shape. Many of the prints were much smaller than normal adult feet, suggesting that children had been present in the building, while others were disproportionately large, indicating individuals of unusual physical dimensions. Gary attempted to follow the trail of footprints, but they led to the edge of the building where the floor opened onto the old dock system. The prints simply stopped at the water's edge, as if whoever had made them had walked directly into Tongass Narrows and disappeared beneath the surface. Over the following nights, Gary encountered similar phenomena throughout the cannery complex, sounds of industrial activity that stopped the moment he investigated their source. Fresh evidence of human presence in areas that had been empty just hours before. And always those mysterious footprints that appeared and disappeared according to no pattern he could understand. The most unsettling incident occurred during Gary's 6th week on the job. He was patrolling the old worker dormitories, checking for signs of break-ins or unauthorized occupancy, when he heard voices coming from one of the buildings that had housed seasonal cannery workers during the facility's operational years. The voices were faint but clearly audible. Multiple people engaged in conversation in what sounded like several different languages. Gary could distinguish English, Spanish, and what might have been Chinese or Japanese, along with other languages he couldn't identify. The conversations had the casual, tired quality of workers finishing a long shift, discussing the day's work, and making plans for the evening. Gary approached the dormitory building carefully, expecting to find a group of transients who had taken shelter in the abandoned structure. But when he entered the building, he found it empty except for the rotting remains of old bunk beds and the accumulated debris of decades of neglect. The voices continued even after Gary entered the building, but they seemed to be coming from rooms that he could see were unoccupied. As he moved through the structure, the conversations followed him, always emanating from spaces just beyond his direct observation, always maintaining the same casual tone despite his obvious presence in the building. In one room, Gary heard what sounded like a poker game in progress, complete with the shuffle of cards, the clink of coins, and the good-natured banter of men relaxing after a day of hard physical labor. But when he entered the room, he found only empty space and the same wet footprints that had appeared throughout the cannery complex. The voices gradually faded as Gary completed his patrol of the dormitory building, but he could hear them resuming in other parts of the complex as he moved away, as if the invisible occupants were following their own schedule of activities that continued regardless of his presence. Gary's final encounter with the cannery's mysterious residents occurred during his 8th week on the job. He was conducting his 2 a.m. patrol when he noticed that lights were visible in the main processing building, flickering electric illumination that seemed to come from work areas deep within the structure. This was impossible for several reasons. The cannery had been disconnected from municipal power services decades earlier, and Gary's flashlight was the only source of illumination that should have been present in the buildings. More importantly, Gary had already completed his patrol of the main building earlier that evening and had found it dark and empty. Gary approached the building cautiously, expecting to find vandals or scavengers who had somehow rigged temporary lighting. But as he drew closer, he realized that the lights weren't coming from portable equipment. They were the overhead fluorescent fixtures that had originally illuminated the cannery's work areas, somehow restored to operation despite the absence of electrical power. Through the building's broken windows, Gary could see the shadows of people moving around the processing floor. Dozens of figures engaged in organized industrial activity. The shadows showed people working at cutting stations, operating machinery, and moving around the floor in the coordinated patterns of experienced cannery workers. Gary entered the building through the main entrance, but the moment he stepped inside, the lights went out and the shadows disappeared. The building returned to its normal state of abandonment, empty and silent, except for the sound of rain dripping through the damaged roof. But on the processing floor, Gary found evidence that extensive work had been completed during the brief period when the lights had been on. Areas that had been cluttered with debris were now clean and organized. Equipment that had been corroded and non-functional appeared to have been restored to working condition. And throughout the work areas, Gary found the remnants of what could only be described as a completed salmon processing operation. Scales, bones, and other organic debris. It suggested thousands of fish had been processed just moments before his arrival. Gary submitted his final security report the next morning and quit his position immediately. He never returned to the old PAF cannery, and he left Ketchikan within the week, choosing to pursue opportunities in Southeast Alaska's tourism industry rather than continue his planned move to Anchorage. The old Pacific American Fisheries Cannery was finally demolished in 1992, 7 years after Gary's experience. The demolition crew reported several unusual incidents during the destruction process. Equipment that operated without power sources, the sound of voices and industrial activity in buildings that had been cleared of all occupants, and the discovery of organic materials that suggested recent fish processing operations, despite the facility's decades of abandonment. Today, the site where the PAF cannery once stood is occupied by a modern seafood processing facility that employs many of Ketchikan's current residents. Workers at the new plant occasionally report unusual phenomena during night shifts. The sound of older, more primitive machinery operating somewhere beneath the modern processing floor, and shadows that seem to show workers engaged in the industrial techniques of an earlier era. And on summer nights, when the salmon runs are at their peak and the modern cannery operates around the clock to process the annual harvest, some workers claim they can hear additional voices mixed with their own, the voices of previous generations of cannery workers still laboring to transform the sea's bounty into the products that have sustained Southeast Alaskan communities for over a century. Outro: What lurks in the frozen silence. These 9 stories from Alaska's most remote communities share something beyond their geographical isolation. They represent encounters with phenomena that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we can explain. Manifestations of something that seems to emerge from Alaska's unique relationship between human communities and the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounds them. In Nome, a man vanished from a busy street in broad daylight, leaving footprints that led to the edge of the world. In Kotzebue, lights appeared in perfect formation over the frozen sound, speaking names in a language that was almost familiar but fundamentally wrong. In Wrangell, an abandoned hospital continued to serve patients who existed only in memory, while Hooper Bay, something that was neither human nor animal, called across the tundra with a voice that spoke of ancient loneliness. The pattern continues through Seldovia, where the ocean itself forgot how to move, and Barrow, where a teacher followed the voices of lost children into a blizzard from which she never returned. In Juneau, tunnels that were meant to protect the living became home to something that built in the darkness with hands too large to be human. In Cordova, fog swallowed Tyne itself, returning fishing boats empty of everything except questions. And in Ketchikan, the ghosts of industrial labor continued their eternal shift in a cannery that existed only in the space between memory and reality. What connects these experiences isn't just their Alaskan setting, but their relationship to places where human communities have pushed against the absolute limits of survival. These are towns where the margin between life and death is measured not in comfort zones or social safety nets, but in degrees of temperature, hours of daylight, and the distance to the nearest help. In such places, the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds seems to become more permeable. The extreme conditions that define daily life in these communities create a kind of psychological and spiritual pressure that allows unusual phenomena to manifest in ways that would be impossible in more moderate environments. Each of these stories involves people who were deeply connected to their environment, individuals whose survival depended on their ability to read the subtle signs and patterns that govern life in the Arctic and subarctic regions. Store clerks who knew their daily routines with precision, born of necessity. Fishermen who could predict weather patterns with their lives depending on their accuracy. Teachers who understood that education in remote communities was literally a matter of connecting children to the knowledge they would need to survive. When such people encounter phenomena that challenge their understanding of how their world works, the implications go beyond simple fear or confusion. These are experiences that threaten the fundamental knowledge systems that make survival possible in places where survival is never guaranteed. The witnesses in these stories share certain characteristics that lend credibility to their accounts. They were not thrill seekers or paranormal enthusiasts looking for extraordinary experiences. They were practical people engaged in the ordinary business of making a living and raising families in extraordinarily challenging environments. Their encounters with the inexplicable occurred during routine activities, checking fish traps, walking home from work, conducting security patrols, returning from fishing trips. More importantly, these witnesses had extensive knowledge of their local environments. They knew the difference between normal and abnormal weather patterns, between familiar and unfamiliar sounds, between the signs of human and animal activity. When such people report experiences that fall outside their extensive knowledge of local conditions, their testimony carries a weight that demands attention. The phenomena described in these stories also share common elements that suggest they might be manifestations of the same underlying forces, expressing themselves through different local conditions. Time distortion appears in multiple accounts: the fog that swallowed hours, the hospital where past and present occupied the same space, the classroom where lessons continued decades after the school had closed. Physical laws seem to become flexible in these encounters. Water that stops moving, footprints that end in mid-step, lights that hover without visible support, sounds that carry impossible distances through Arctic air. These aren't violations of natural law, so much as glimpses of places where natural law operates according to different principles. Perhaps most significantly, many of these stories involve communication attempts by entities that seem to exist partially in our physical reality and partially in some other dimension of experience. Voices calling names in broken languages, teachers conducting classes for invisible students, workers continuing shifts in demolished factories. These phenomena suggest intelligence trying to bridge the gap between different states of existence. Alaska's extreme conditions may create ideal circumstances for such phenomena to manifest. The sensory deprivation of Arctic winter, the psychological pressure of isolation, a life or death focus required for survival in harsh environments. All of these factors might contribute to a heightened awareness of subtle phenomena that remain undetectable under more moderate conditions. But these stories suggest something more than heightened perception. They describe encounters with entities or forces that seem to be attracted to the kind of communities that exist at the absolute margins of human habitation, as if something about the struggle to maintain civilization at the edge of the wilderness creates conditions that allow other forms of consciousness to interact with our physical reality. The people who live in these remote Alaskan communities have developed practical approaches to dealing with phenomena that urban residents might find impossible to accept. They acknowledge the experiences, incorporate them into their understanding of local conditions, and adjust their behavior accordingly without feeling the need to explain or rationalize what they've encountered. This pragmatic acceptance might be one of the most important lessons these stories offer. In places where survival depends on responding appropriately to conditions that might not make immediate sense, the ability to acknowledge and adapt to unusual phenomena becomes a valuable survival skill rather than a sign of weakness or delusion. Tonight, as you return to the comfort and safety of your own community, remember that there are places in this world where the familiar rules don't always apply. Places where the boundary between known and unknown becomes as thin as the ice that forms each. Winter on Arctic seas, places where people continue to live and work and raise families, despite encounters with phenomena that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of reality. These 9 stories from Alaska's remote communities remind us that the world is larger and stranger than our daily experience suggests. They challenge us to remain open to possibilities that exist beyond the edges of our maps, in the spaces between what we can prove and what we cannot deny. And they invite us to remember that in the vast, frozen silence of the world's most remote places, we are never truly alone.